Hello, everybody, and welcome to a fully prepared book club. A fully prepared. I am massively prepared in that I actually am like a couple chapters ahead now. So, and my brain is I don't know, like it's in all chapters at once. So, and I've built a castle. And we're going to talk about castles later today. Um, I still have to figure out my intention. I can tell you guys that I have been dealing with a lot of connections. I've been doing Genesis 1, which Christopher has so nicely commented on. Um, Commentary on my YouTube channel and the Genesis 1 commentary is allowing me to have a firm foundation to approach all the other things in the Bible because like things starting to make sense from there. Um, Also, it has me disagreeing or at least being frustrated with some of Matthieu's stuff. I don't know if we're gonna get there, but the good part is a lot of stuff opens up, so we can just focus on that aspect instead of focusing on the disagreements. So yeah, I'll be focusing on getting myself an intention, and I will pass the stick to Mark.
You're passing the stick to me. Oh, that was not expected. Oh, good. We got Danny here too. That's excellent. Look, my intention, as always, is to draw in as much pattern stuff as I can find that you guys might be missing, and help you through this whole process. I mean, we've been struggling through. I didn't think the day would come, but that day is here. Getting through this one chapter, which couldn't manage in the last 2 hours session, and it's understandable as to why. So yeah, I was outside earlier today doing some work in the yard, and well, mostly in the shed, and so hopefully that'll like spur the where do these patterns show up, elsewhere. So yeah, I mean the same old intent, different chapter. Hopefully we'll finish this one up, and I'm glad we skipped last week because I was still recovering from the 17,000 illnesses I've had in a row. Christopher, why don't you bring some sanity to this for us?
I'm still doing having being becoming established here. So that's been trying to observe more and more how things are established and ought to be established, and listening to a few videos Mark's done, his signaling one last night and how it pairs with the museum video earlier, and that's what I'm thinking about here. So Danny?
Yeah, so I found the Bible symbolism to be very weird in chapter 65 on sickness. Spent quite a bit of time just trying to understand. I just found just pretty incomprehensible. But even if I just sort of grant, Matthieu Pageau, if I just take all of all of what he says, even if I grant all that, I was still just meditating on the so what aspect of the concept of sickness generally. Mark mentioned 17,000 illnesses. Like, there's a lot of ways. Like, I pulled an all-nighter last night, for example, and like crashed super hard, right? There's a lot of ways of different forms of sickness, in the same way in which we talked about, like, your diet's not just what you eat, right? I mean, many of which, maybe are just unacknowledged. But even if you consider the most common things like anxiety, depression, ADHD, for example, like these are forms of sickness that are not disease, right? And like if you think of, at the physical level of dopamine or serotonin being messed up from watching TV or just the way in which we live. If you ask the question, what do you mean by disease, you can go a lot of different directions. So I mean, I'm just meditating on that concept, but really struggling with trying to understand what's the spiritual significance of this Bible stuff. I mean, we can kind of riff on sickness all day long, but I'm just missing. I guess I'm missing the spiritual aspect of the text. So I guess I'm seeking for that, and I guess it's the state I'm in, at the angle at which I'm looking at this from. So I'll leave it at that. It's not really an intention. I guess I'm getting a grip. I'm an exemplar of what's the word? Tizah. That's what the word is. I'm an exemplar of Tizah. I'll leave it at that.
I have to recommend last night's live stream on Navigating Patterns.
So because I pulled all nighter, dude, I literally listened to like 12 hours of you talking. And cleaned my entire house. I meal prepped and cleaned the whole. So, like, I was hallucinating. Well, I mean, again, there were like things where I couldn't tell. There's so many thoughts. I mean, we're talking about visions. Again, this is kind of getting into some of my notes here. But I mean, there are things in which I can't tell the difference between reality versus dream. So one of the points that is made is, or one of the objections that I have is, why is the conscious state not or less real than, or more real than the dream state? Like in the dream state, I regularly get insights about situations, given information. You could say you see things. You get a perspective shift in dreams. Like if you're working hard, like programming, you can get answers to problems. You can find insights on like relationships. Like when you work to the state of physical exhaustion, and then you have, and then you like go to sleep, there are things that happens in the cycle of renewal. Like, so I was thinking about the cycle of renewal process. Anyway, I'm sort of jumping ahead. Let me just ask one quickly. What aspect of the previous live streams?
Signals matter.
Signals?
Yeah, it's the signals that affect everything, and what you surround yourself with, right? Because that's what matters.
Yeah, I have long-winded response to that, but we'll just get going and we'll see what comes up.
Yeah. Just mull it in your mind. What you got for us, Castle?
So, I've been trying to get a grip on a few things. Ever since you lost your 17,000 illnesses, they came right over to me. So I blame you completely. And I am trying to get a grip on them and do the work that you did not, and try to remove them from the earth, taking responsibility here. But I've just been thinking a little bit more. I say been the last 20 minutes since I tried to start catching up, so I can pretend to be prepared. I did all these notes like a week ago, but I was thinking a little bit more about this thing about like gripping things, like gripping the staff, raising it up, something being in suspense, and also the value and the usefulness of that. Also being in suspense yourself, or something having a grip on you, say like an illness or something like that. Being able to get a grip on something because it has a grip on you. Like there is kind of a mutual embracing aspect that goes on there. I think the fact that I'm currently not feeling well might actually help me have better insights for the disease chapter. And I'm actually like, I find value in that, which is interesting. Like just kind of changing the perspective, the sort of like, it's not you that has me, but I have you type of thing. But thinking about that, also thinking about this aspect of when you're trying to, you take kind of like it's not specifically her, but the way that Sabine Hassenfelder kind of talks about like the low entropy reservoir thing, that especially if you're trying to if you're trying to behave as a low entropy reservoir for a larger space or something that's larger than you, which has high entropy, that you were essentially taking that on, and then you have to go and find a larger low entropy reservoir to then get cleaned up. It's a lot like bailing water or something like that. You have to fill the bucket in order to get rid of the water that's filling the boat. And so I've been kind of experiencing that, where as I've been getting involved in a lot of things, working on larger projects with big organizations or large buildings and these sorts of things, that I'm encountering hazards to myself. but it's very necessary. I mean, just the fact that there's a lot of things that are just not very well maintained. And so the fact that there aren't enough people getting a grip on the environment, something is getting a grip on it. And in order to get a grip on that, you have to now deal with all of these other things that moved in. So just kind of, I've just been kind of experiencing that. Also, this aspect of once you have taken on the high entropy, then there is a necessity for exile, so that you can then go out into the low entropy reservoir that's bigger than you, that is not also going to just refill back into the space that you were in before. So just kind of mulling all of this over the last, few minutes. And so that'll probably inform a lot of the stuff that I share here.
Great.
Nice. So I was struggling a little bit with my intention, and I settled on space as dominion, right? Which connects to Christopher's establishment, right? I use the word settle, right, which is also establishing. So we will get into the amazing picture of establishing space, which I had infinite associations with, because it's the pattern that keeps on giving. So I'm not sure the way I want to talk about it, and I feel like I want to have it as least of a monologue as possible, because I think the bouncing things off each other is actually more fleshing things out, and talking about fleshing things out, that's literally what we're going to talk about, like the fleshing things out of the space. So oh yeah, and also, like, I canceled last week and I ended up ending early, so I was like in time to do the live stream last week. But I sat alone on the Discord as a sad boy. That was unfortunate. Anyway, we were talking about seizing the land, right? And about the three phases. Okay, so it's interesting. If he's putting them sequentially, he's okay. Now I am confused about the way that he's framing things, because I would do it differently. I guess I want to give people some opportunity to bring up things from last week or 2 weeks back. I guess that's too long ago. So there's like, I want to point at Genesis, where in day one there's light, right? So that's like a shining onto a space, right? Like it's putting a light onto something. Then we're getting to day two. That's the separation of the waters, where there's a domain or something under the light that is allowed to house something, right? Hold something. And thirdly, there's the waters retreating from the land, right? So then the land is actually capable of holding things, right? So I'm pointing at this because there's 3 steps, right? So there's one step is kind of like the assignment, right? The perspective, the lighting of something, right? The putting a light or attention on something. The secondly is the option space that gets created, and then thirdly the actuality, the manifestation within that option space that we get to play with, right? And so we're dealing with fractal repetitions of this pattern, and yeah, I'll just go to the big picture that just blew my mind, which is in the center of.
Well, Manuel, before we do that, let's just quickly. I just had to do some quick research here. Let's just quickly. I mean, I think Christopher was giving a nice, when we left off 2 weeks ago, a nice summary of this diagram, the seizing the land, right? And so I didn't want to jump straight from, that part of Genesis into Exodus, right? So that fractal pattern that you pointed out is re-expressed, we'll say one layer up, which is probably the best we can do for how to think about it, in this seizing of the land, right? And I think it's worth noticing that establishing space is not building, it's removal of water, right? And I know, I think we covered this before, but I wanted to cover it again, maybe even from a different perspective, right? And the lead home is bring out of exile, right? And then support space is resist time, right? And so space is the thing that's fighting, or to support space is to fight the entropy at some layer. There's lots of ways to do that, right? First is you can stack bricks on top of each other, and then they're less entropic, right? Before that, you can make the bricks, right? Whether they're mud brick or they're fired clay or whatever, right? And so this idea of remove waters, bring out of exile, and resist time is super important, I think, to the diagram that's coming up. And then the balancing of the highs and lows of the change, right? And I don't actually like the word balance because it generally implies two things, right? And I understand why we need to use that. So fair enough if that's the best you can do mentally. No shade on you, but it's because we tend to think of balancing as a point, and points mathematically don't exist, by the way. That's always worth thinking about. We don't think of it balance as a process. All balancing is a process because time is like the effects of time are real. And so when you think about it that way, I think it helped, because this is all going to help in that final diagram. I think it helps you to understand the balance is a type of work, right? An actual type of effort in the world, independent of you. That's work. Thought is not effort independent of you. It's not work. Sorry. I know everybody hates that. Also uses up more energy than anything else you do, but life is tricky, huh? So when you think about we're resisting time by supporting space, right? Those are roughly the same thing. And these cosmic pillars that are balancing out these highs and lows. You're not doing away with highs and lows. It doesn't say you're making the highs less high and the lows less low. It doesn't even say that. So that's still on the table. It just says you're balancing them out. Right. In other words, you don't want to be too high all the time and you don't want to be too low all the time. And that to me is what's important, right? It's that process of the balancing. And then the question would be, well, what pattern or patterns are ideal if you buy into this, which, I mean, you're reading the book, you should be buying into it, right? If you buy into this, what pattern or patterns help you to do this, right? To do this balancing of the highs and lows. And yeah, I think that with that, I mean, unless other people probably have better things to add, we can, I'm done. We could move to the diagram from my perspective, but I don't know how much more stuff we actually want to go over. If anybody missed anything from 2 weeks ago that they wanted to exemplify or point out.
I just want to mention one quick thing, just with respect of the natural cycle being artificially fixed by a pillar. There on the on that last paragraph, that he says, this is an example of halting time, and just a couple of little practical examples, I guess, that people might encounter a lot. I was thinking about like a bicycle, that you've got this thing that doesn't really balance on its own. You can have a kickstand to keep it up, but within the process of keeping those things moving, you need the mediator as the sort of pillar that's sitting on these cycles, that is kind of doing the process of balancing. You can't just stay completely straight, otherwise you'll fall over or something like that. So I just wanted to mention that. And then in the footnote of this page, that there's the bit about Joshua defeating his enemies by extending a spear. So there is this bit about like kind of extending the staff. So you have that during the Exodus, but you also have it at Moses oversees multiple battles, and he has to still raise the staff during those battles. And it actually, some of the battles go on for so long that he actually needs other people to hold his arm up for him. So he's there and he's got like multiple people leading him, where they set up like another thing so that he can keep his arm up. And if he's not able to do it, the Israelites actually stop doing well in battle. And so you take that and then add to the bit about Joshua defeating his enemies, that in that battle he just has a spear pointed at the city, and it's in that entire time it actually winds up just everyone actually runs out of it. Like they come out to fight him essentially, and then his own guys go in there and just completely destroy the thing. But he keeps that focus completely on them, 100%, like suspended in the air. And so you're saying here, that Joshua is bidding God to halt time, and then when the remaining guys are captured, they are hanged on trees as well. So there's a little bit of this kind of motion going on over and over again during those battle scenes.
Yeah, I guess I want to go along Mark's framing with the three things. It's like, because my mind went into hope, right? So in order to remove the waters, you need to kind of hope into the darkness, right? To allow something to come forth, right? So when you're hoping, you're, well, Daniel was talking about dreaming, right? Like it's like in some sort of dreamy state about what could be possible, right? Like it's like a touching of the water or something, and feeling if you can get hold on to something, right? And then the leading home, right? Like when you hold on to something, right? Like you need to work towards it, right? And I would uh, connect it to faith, right? So when you catch a fish in in the sea, right? Now you gotta reel it in. Like you gotta make it come to you in a manner, right? So that you can consume it, right? Like it can become part of you. And then love, I would connect then to maintenance, right? So when we have this fish, right? Like that fish requires certain things, right? So uh, or when we have settled, like we need to honor our place and upkeep it, right? Like resist the influences of time while at the same time beautifying it, right? So I would connect the virtue of love to that, right? So that kind of sets the three heavenly virtues on this map, and I think that's pretty solid, actually. Okay, then oh wait, I forgot. Here's the so um yeah, well, the spear is also a point, right? So it's focusing attention. Um, that's important. And so I think we went over this the last time, where when you do something, right, in a, I don't know what the frame was that we were using. Oh yeah, it was Moses with the staff in front of the Pharaoh. That was what we were talking about, right? But that's like this Kairos moment, right? Like you're focusing everything on a point, right? And then beyond that, everything gets reestablished, right? Like a new order. Well, we can see it now with Trump, right? Like so he's putting everything at once, and then like in some sense a chaos happens, right? Because things aren't settled. It's like you put like the mud in like a lake or something, right? You put it up, right, and like it goes all around, and then it settles at a new place, right? Like it forms a new floor that we can build upon, right? And before that, there's unclarity, right? Like in this uncertainty in the unclarity, and I think now I gotta talk about this establishment of space. So I saw a lot of things in this pattern, but maybe because it's articulated as a verb, right? It's an establishing. So it's also in a process, right? So it's under or from the center, right? From that which grants its identity, right? And we're using the white dot, so it's known, right? It's clear. It then starts forming a area, right? And that area has an outside, a body and a center. That's the way that I'm reading it, right? And the center would be the head, right? Or like it would be the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden, right? There's and and then we have the influence of time, right? Which is basically gnawing away at the identity, right? So we were talking about the necessity of resisting time, right? So there's a way in which the time affects the space, right? And Daniel was talking about the next chapter and the disease, right? Or well, leprosy, which is a skin disease, right? And that's related to this, right? Like it's basically the gnawing of time or entropy on the external structure, right? Or the boundary of the structure that is maintaining the sanctity of the space that is held, right? So like a physical body, right? Like if you get a skin disease, then your mediation with the external world is broken. So yeah, like I'll take a more responsive attitude, but I have a lot of things to say about this.
Well, one way to look at this too is to say that the previous diagram was about the starting point, like how you start things off, and this diagram is more about the maintenance, right? So once you've seized the land, once you've established space by removing the waters, right? Once you've been led home by being brought out of exile, right? And once you've supported space, what it looks like is this, right? And then the way you maintain this. So notice this is actually sort of very significant. I think people probably miss it. The way you establish something is different from the way you maintain the thing once it's been established. And that may seem like a banal or basic point, but it's actually really important to understand because everyone gets confused about this, right? Like, and that pattern's pretty much everywhere, right? That if you're an entrepreneur and you found a company, when it gets to 50 or 100 people, odds are you shouldn't be there anymore because maintaining a large enough organization is probably not in your skill set. And an extremely small number of successful entrepreneurs, which is already a small number, by the way, I'm talking about really small numbers, can make the transition, but almost none of them can, right? And that's because building something requires a completely different set of skills than maintaining it. And so, and you can see that pattern actually anywhere, right? And it also has broad implications for hierarchy and maintaining levels of hierarchy, right? Not understanding things below you on purpose, because maybe it's different sets of skills are super super specific and can't be transported from one layer to another, right? And everyone's got their cognitive limits. And so when you look at it, I think it's useful to think of it that way, right? The establishment versus the maintenance.
Yeah, and I think the analogy that we might want to start working with is a tent, right? Like a really simple one where you have one pole in the center, right? So the center is holding up the tent. Then you have the space of the tent in which things can happen, right? Which would be like the second area. And the third area would be the boundary, right? The tarp of the tent, right? Where it's mediating between the outside and the inside, right? So it would keep out rain, it would keep out sun, right? But then, like if you've ever been in a tent, right? Like rain gets transformed into sound, and the sun still lights the inside. It's just not lighting it as the sun, but it's lighting it as the lit up tarp, which is actually what happens in Genesis day 4, where the lights on the second heaven get established, right? So there's a in the established space, like because you put up the tent, right? Like you have to lift up the tarp, right? You have to settle the stick that holds everything up, right? Then you have to decorate the insides of the tent, right? So having that setup period is, like Mark says, completely different than inhabiting and living or sleeping in the tent, right? Because now you're using the space, right? You need to keep out the dirt, right? You need to keep it the externals clean. You need to keep it fat or whatever, so that the moisture doesn't get in. All of these aspects, right? That require you to think different, right? Priorities are different, and threats are different, right?
Yeah, I was looking at this. Oh, please go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say one of the things that's happening, I think, in this is that you have the clear dot in the center. That's like the unifying principle, or the telos, like emanating down onto the space.
Yep.
And that's you were saying you were saying about removing water, and that's the way you remove water is like you have the sun emanate down on it, dry it out. You can have air blow across it, and that remove some, or you can like lower a pump into the water. This is all like there's a telos coming down to remove the water and establish the space here. And yeah,
Right. It comes from outside and hopefully above, right? And that's
right. Yeah,
there are other ways
that
to
was
remove the water, but they're not as good. So yeah, telos matters. No, I'm
Right.
glad you caught that.
And that was
Well
the other thing is that if you are like establishing a space, the telos is also coming down on you.
Yeah. Yes.
So
emanation is real. Yes.
Yeah.
Something that I
Go ahead.
something that I was kind of hoping, or I'm not sure if this will come up later in the book. Actually, I don't remember. But one thing that I was, and maybe it would make this a little too busy, but I was slightly aggrieved that the as in the previous diagram, the way that he uses the dark arrow, and then he uses the light arrow, and there's kind of that reciprocal movement going on there. Then you could do a lot more with this image if you had that kind of motion going on here. But I just wanted to point out with the fact that the 12 tribes, so he's also giving this as additionally an image of the way the tribes were stationed when they were out in the desert. He says that they were stationed around the pillar, and then he in the last paragraph, he says, by virtue of Moses receiving the image of God, his staff also became a miniature image of God's cosmic staff, the spatial pillar. So you have the entire camp is stationed around the image of God. So I was going and I was delving into sort of the etymology of image and everything. So image and imitation and those sorts of things come from like the word for aim. So if you're aiming at something, like you're looking to make a copy of it, and that's actually what it comes up as. And so when I was looking at copy, this is, you can have reproduction or what have you, but it comes from copia, as in like copious. So you have like an abundance. And that itself can be broken down to the power, wealth, or resources with, or to produce an abundance with, or something like that. So it's a lot like by receiving the image of God, or this is also kind of like an image of grace that he's received on the inside there, that he's got this sort of copy or condescension of that. And that's where I was kind of hoping. I was like, oh, you see the tiny little circle in there, but I'm seeing that echoed in the larger circle outside. And I was like, oh, there's also, if you flipped the directionality of those arrows, you'd have an image of condescension as well. And so there's a lot that could be done here, but I won't go too deep into that, because I suspect that we'll see something like this again later.
Well, I want to go fairly deep into it, actually. So in some sense, right, Christopher already mentioned that the emanation at the start, right? So in the camp, you had the ark at the center, right? Or the temple, the tent that was housing the ark, right? So, and then you had the high priest there, who's like separate, like he's on the personal level in relation to the tribes, right? So there's a qualitative difference between the center, right? The purpose of why the whole of Israel's there, right? And then the body of Israel that is manifest around it. So I want to point out a bunch of things, right? So we're talking about he's saying the 12 tribes or staves, right? So if we look at the arrows, right, there's 12 points that they cross the squares, right, which would be corresponding with one of the tribes. And then there's a tribe that's at the center, right, to each cardinal direction, right, to the north, east, south, and west. And they have their own space, right, because they're called a stave, right? So they establish their own space as a part of this bigger space, right? So that's important to see, right? And so then you can see that they all fulfill a role, right? So the outer boundary, right, has one role type, right, which is mediation between the inside and the outside. The middle one has a role that is with related to manifestation, right? Like it's the workings of the camp, right? And the center one has to do with the maintenance of the temple, right, or the tent, whatever they call it. And so all of these three, well, if you look at the arrows, right, there's means by which things travel to the center and back out into the world, right? So they get translated, they get transformed. Just imagine that a messenger starts at the center, right, and needs to go to the outside, or the other way around, right? When something of the outside, right, like news, for example, comes in, right, like it needs to go through these mediations, these translations, right? And so every pillar has a role, right? So if we want to use this as sort of a map of reality, right? Like we have to start understanding, okay, like what are the relationships of the skin, right? Like what are the relationships of the body? What are the relationships of the head? how does the head relate to the body? How does the body relate to the skin? How does the head relate to the skin, right? What's the role of the skin, right? And then you have the four directions, right? So the four directions are related to the north, which is heaven, and the south, which is earth, and then you have the east, which is the seed, right? The thing where things start, right? Where the sun comes up, and then you have the west, where it's related to fulfillment, right? Like the finishing of things, right? So you could say the start and the finish. Um, and the role of the skin has a specific quality to each of those domains, right? And like I don't have it fully clear in my head because it's a lot, but this is something I'm planning to do some work on, because I think if we start organizing organizations in this manner, right, where we have people specialize on these posts literally, right, um, and then like I think things would be more streamlined. Um,
Yeah, certainly the old corporate structure was exactly that, right? You had 5 parts. You had a CEO at the top and you had 4 specialties beneath. And those corporations lasted a lot longer than modern corporations. And I know everybody says we can't go back. Well, we sure as hell better, because we've made some wrong turns since then. That's only one of a zillion or so examples that I know of. I also wanted to point out one thing, because I think I can demonstrate it sufficiently. If you pay attention to the diagram not as somebody looking at it from above looking down below, but somebody in the diagram at a particular ordinal location, like east. If you were facing the pillar, there's only one, it's in the center. You would be facing in a particular direction, west. Another person, if they were, say, at the north, would not be facing in the same direction. The reason why I point all this out is because direction doesn't work. Right? And people say stupid things, like Sam Harris says, well, we can know the most evil, which is already wrong, but let's just say that he wasn't wrong about that even though he's almost certainly wrong about that, because he can't do it, and I've never met anybody who can. Right? Going in the opposite direction doesn't make any sense and wouldn't work. Right? It makes a lot of presumptions about how many dimensions the world has, where you're standing, and what your options for directionality are. And in a 3-dimensional set, direction doesn't do anything for you, right? It may be required, but it's not sufficient, right? It's necessary, but insufficient. And so when people start talking about direction, you better make sure that they've given you enough framework that direction is all you need, right? In addition to the framework that either they've given you previously or you already had. And that's just a little trick for finding people like Sam Harris who are enchanting you with bullshit, basically total garbage. So remember to read this in particular as though not just to see the whole picture, because your job is not to see the whole picture, because to see the whole picture the way we're seeing it here is an almost godlike view. And you don't have that when you live. Like, I don't have that. I don't even think Christopher has that, right? And so, the perspective you have is one of those cardinal locations, right? And then the pillar, which should be what you're paying attention to, and you're still affected by the time snake, right? You're not getting around that, but you have to maintain the structure. You can't say, "Oh, this structure got corrupt, so I'm going to tear it down." That's not a good plan, right? So you got one bad apple in the army. You don't disband the army. That doesn't make any sense. And so, hopefully, you can see, without me getting overt about it, how this would connect to everything going on right this minute. So I just wanted to point that out, because I think it's super important, because people can get tied up in the knowing of the thing rather than the where am I in this and what does that mean to my life, which is putting yourself somewhere on that diagram and not just looking at it the way we're looking at it, we'll say.
So I just had a lot of I mean, okay, I have one is a what's the word? Like a image or an image for this diagram, and the second is maybe a more practical application of it is on the three things that we mentioned is the establishment, the maintenance, and the boundary of these three themes. I think are really missing in a lot of our thinking these days. And like what Mark has said before, an object isn't one thing. So when I look at the circle around the outside as the effects of time, I think of like erosion. And it first erodes the outside boundary until you hit certain inflection points at different levels of scale. If it rains long enough and hard enough on your tent, let's say you're on a hill, then as the problems accumulate to the point where they hit certain levels of scale, where the game changes and layers 2 and 1 change. So your establishment and maintenance position is now, instead of a tent, now you're sliding down the hill. Your tent's no longer a tent. It's now a vehicle or a bowling ball that's going to hit your friends. It could be neutral, like you could be hostile. So your map of reality or the roles will be different. So that was one image that I have of erosion, eroding the boundary, but more practically, there's a book called A Purpose and Desire that I read. In biology, there's one of the points it made is there's a lot of words that are self-referential that always raise red flags, like natural selection, equilibrium, homeostasis. These things are defined in and of themselves, and oftentimes you'll see all kinds of what's not like Jesus smuggling, but like I don't know, some kind of evolutionary propaganda smuggling.
Telos smuggling.
Yeah, telos smuggling. Okay,
Yeah,
you see all kinds of
smuggling.
like insane telos smuggling in science, where like an example in the book would be like there's a image of two rocks that were balanced on top of each other, and they'd say, okay, here's an example of a system that's in homeostasis. So again, this is a pit like if you're looking at this diagram, it's like okay, everything's cool, but then as it rains, the center, the point of over hundreds of years, this is like some famous rock in South America or something like that, big and heavy. It eroded, and then the rocks fell off, and it broke into a bunch of pieces, and now you have lots of pebbles scattered on the ground. So the question is the system now in homeostasis? And the answer is yes, right? According to a different set of criteria, etc. for everything else. Population of deer, population of wolves. So like, this is, in my opinion, a simple model, but like, anyway, I could maybe add a little bit more, but the rain and erosion is kind of what came to mind on that time circle, and then some of those other applications, and that I think brings up again the establishment, the maintenance, and the boundaries of things as aspects. Like I that's why I really like this diagram. I think this diagram is a really dense and powerful tool for thinking about. You could place any object or many things at the center of this. And it's a very good tool for thinking.
Yeah, and I want to point out homeostasis in science is a trick word. It's literally a trick word. What it means is it ain't moving. That's what it means. That's all it means, right? And the rocks is a great example of how complexity collapses quickly. Rocks are balanced. There's no reason to think that they're not going to stay balanced forever. The reason why is because any number of things could happen, all of which could have already happened but didn't, to cause that. And so you discount it. You go, well, obviously the wind isn't strong enough to blow them over because it hasn't happened. And that's a fair way to think, by the way. Like, yeah, it's also true, right? And so, the rain could have eroded it, but it hasn't happened, right? And so we can't mentally pin down potential in the future, right? The past is extremely certain, right? And the future is extremely uncertain. We have a big problem with this. All homeostasis means is that after the complexity collapse occurred, which happened very quickly, one rock fell and then bang, there's a bunch of pieces and we're right back to homeostasis. So in other words, for non-agentic things, objects, homeostasis is the normal state. Right? Things are not moving. True. Right. And then the whatever's acting upon them, whatever force is acting upon them is acting upon them. Right. And then there's any number of agents you can ascribe to that. But basically there's really only two. We'll call them the non-material agents and then people and animals, the material agents. And then there's no agent called capitalism, for example. Like, that's not an agent. There's no agent called government. right? There are people that act in accordance with the government to give the government agency. That's a very different thing, though. And understanding those concepts, because you're right, Danny, yeah, we're really missing that. Science often doubles up on telos, right? Like science starts from a telos, then they pretend like they've broken free, a la Immanuel Kant, who you shouldn't read because he says dumb things that are obviously stupid and proceeds from stupidity into worse stupidity. That's modern philosophy in a nutshell, everything past Aristotle, by the way. And so what you get is it's trying to break free and go, well, really, let us assign another telos, and we'll use our own system to assign a telos, and that's all self-reference. By definition, it has to be. And self-reference is bad. And so whenever you hear that, to your point, like just run away. They're not, and nothing's being said, right? You can't make a statement like, well, what we need to do is get to the really real. Okay, that doesn't make any sense. I didn't say anything, and you cannot make sense of that. Or actually, to be fair, you will try to make sense of that and come up with a nonsense that you think is reasonable because I didn't make any sense. It's a type of enchantment that you participate in actively, most people. And so the reason why this diagram is important is because it shows you the structure that needs to be maintained in order for square space, right, to be to hold against the cyclical time. And yet water erosion, wind erosion, sandblast something, right? I mean, this is why I highly recommend archery and sailing, both of which I've done, and it's a lot of sailing. You really learn a lot about these things through those processes and through that kind of engagement, right? Just understanding, like any boat you have to bail the damn boat. Right? I mean, there are holes surrounded by water into which you throw money, and it just turns out that water's going to get into them no matter what you do.
So I want to add, because I just wanted to add an additional thing, a little bit about the roundness, and just kind of call back to some of the previous chapters that we've had, where you have the cyclical time, but you also have the fact that the roundness is also completeness. And you also have the fact that at the very center of all those squares is yet another round thing. So you have self-similar practicality happening. It's happening also within a set of layers of the next. So we have the alternating squares and circles. So you got the self-similar practicality of the squares, and then you have like multiple layers going in. And then you have, because we could look at this as a mountain, but we could also look at it as the verticality is sort of implicit, but the way the tents are arranged could actually be on a flat, patch of land or something like that. They were moving a lot, so you could get both. But thinking about that bit about you have the completeness of the camp, because also remember that they had the tribes, but then they also had people who were traveling with them. So you had foreigners that they were not part of the official tribes or anything, but they were making sacrifice and they were praying and they were contributing on the outside. And I'm just going to insist for the purpose of what I'm saying, because we're not going to see this image again until a different orientation at like chapter 74. And so, which it is more or less the same image, but it's a different angle. And I want to kind of point out that it really is useful to imagine, like with the other diagrams, that if you had arrows going in and out or up and down, however you're looking at this diagram, because you also have the fact that yes, you have the leadership and the spirit. If you do imagine this again as a pyramid or a hierarchy, you have the spirit and the leadership hierarchy kind of going down and out to the rest of the people. You got the warriors and you got the worker guys on the outside and everything. But then also you have the fact that people are bringing in sacrifice and they need materials to maintain the inside of the camp. So you need to have people who are providing the gold and the food and the incense and all of these different things, which is going to be coming from outside the camp as well. So I wanted to point that out, and I wanted to point out also, because of the sort of self-similar practicality going on here, that you have a copy essentially at the very center You could imagine, that the way that we had previous diagrams where you have the little magnifying glass and it's just the same image over and over again, that you could have that just as easily at that center little circle showing exactly an image like this. And I just wanted to kind of go ahead.
I want to add a little bit to it, because I don't think it's only at the center circle. I think it's at every crossing of the arrow and the boundary, right?
Yes, so I'm working to that. Yeah.
Okay.
So, what I was going to just kind of, and you probably have an angle that I don't have yet, but that you have kind of a final cause thing going on here. So again, if you imagine the arrow is kind of going in and out, you have this thing of, you have the aim or the copy or the image, as all those words are very closely related, or the seed, if you will, at the very center. Even thinking about like a fruit with its seed on the inside or something like that.
Fountain.
Yeah. And so you have that image going on there. You have the sort of final cause of, you have the image of God at the center of the camp, or the copy of God, or whatever you would do depending on the different etymological roots. And then you have the completeness, and that's the camp. And then you can keep on kind of doing that out to the cosmic scale if you wanted to. But you also get if you do have the movement and as you said, the crossing over of the arrows over those different layers, you're also getting a third thing there. So that interaction between the inside and the outside, you are getting yet another thing, which is proceeding from the inside and from the outside. So
yeah, and like I wanted to connect that with the erosion idea that Daniel was talking about, right? So all of these nodes, right, they have their own integrity, right? And like if they lose their purpose, right, they sin, right, or they get diseased, like we'll see in the next chapter. They become an instigator of time, right? Like the cyclical time for the next layer, right? So you can see time as something that's chronologically like chronos, right? It's just like a clock, moment by moment by moment, or you can see time as event driven, right? So what happens is, like, why is something in stasis? Because it's uneventful, right? There's no events happening, right? And so how would you describe the rock that's not falling over? Well, you would describe it as its initial position and then as its fallen over position, and you wouldn't care about all the chronological data in which no mutations happen, right? So it's natural to focus on the mutations, right? And so if we're talking about mutations, we're basically saying that there's like a point at which action occurs, right? And like what the source of the point is not really important, like, but you can envision it as a messenger, right, arriving at the camp, right, or an angel announcing something to the structure, right, and then a response needs to be made, right, and that response can happen while remaining true to the space that you've established, right, or that response can be in sin, right, and so when you're in sin, now you are you are endangering the space, right? You're endangering the stability of the space, and those can result into disease, right? They can result into destruction, right? Like I think this is where the thief came to steal, to kill, and to destroy, right? So there's a way in which the border isn't maintained, right, which would be stealing, and then the killing would be where life isn't sustained, and destroying is that the whole identity is no longer available, right? So yeah, I think it's important to have these things in the back of your mind, like these framings in the back of your mind when you're reading the Bible, right? Because like I think most things can actually map onto these aspects, right? And then you can see the way that things affect other things at what level and what the implications are, and that affords you understanding of your own life. Um, does anybody want to hop in here?
Well, when Castle said warriors, I immediately thought of a microcosm of a city. And if you spent like a year reading the Republic, then anytime you hear the word city for the rest of your life, it's impossible to not think of like 100 different dimensions. So when looking at this image, you know, you could go on and on about how warriors need to be supported. There's business class, there's many different classes, and the circle around the city, as you know, again, not to get too much into the Republic, but in Book 8, from generation to generation, the Zeitgeist exerts different forces on the city, right? So, like 1970s America, when 1% of everyone's fat, is not 2025 America, right? We're in a different place. And so, when thinking about, again, you could scale this up to the cosmic level, but ultimately, like, God is, when you think at the cosmic level of God as being the source of justice, the complexity of zooming back into like the present moment, like I don't know how to put it into words. That would be it's just too much to unpack. But it's good to know, or it's at least it's helpful to be aware of. What am I trying to say? That's going to be useful. Time and place. I lost my train of thought. I was going to try to terminate because I was thinking about a whole bunch of different directions. Anyway, when Castle said warriors, I thought of a microcosm of the city, and yeah, I don't. Anyway, I don't really know where to go. I don't really know what the point I was going to make with that. I'll just leave that as an observation.
Well, this actually leads into a pin post I put on my Twitter, where I'm talking about how cities are no longer properly cities, right? Because like their boundaries, well, and everything, right? Like we're not having proper boundaries, right? So the first level of mediation with the outside, with the entropy, is basically removed, right? So we're literally naked, right? Like we're with our flesh exposed, and the way like Daniel was talking about, right? Like the way things appear to flesh, right? So for example, if there's cold and I have skin, like cold is one thing, but like if the skin is removed and it's cold, it's just flat out pain, right? Like it's immediately going into my nerves, right? So the ability to appropriately react, well, proportional is also there, right? But to appropriately react is removed because I have direct exposure, right? Like the direct exposure, and then you get into a whole different worldview, I guess, right? And like this might be actually interesting to discuss at some point. I don't know about now, but this idea that if you have immediate exposure to everything without interpreting it, I guess, right, or transforming the signal into something that's usable by a buffer, then the way that the world appears to you is going to be completely different, right? And so the needs that you have, right, like the things that you want government to do for you, for example, are going to be completely different than if you do have that skin that is mediating for you, right? And so like because in some sense, like the government is going to have to be that skin for you if you don't have it yourself, and you get really strange dynamics at that point. So I'll add a bunch of things that we can put into here, right? So we already talked about the garden. We can talk about pyramids, cities, castles, um, like houses, churches, right? Like all of these things you can put into this framing. Like I think well, Peugeot is talking about leaving things at the sides, right? So like you can see gargoyles on the edges, right? Like that are getting rid of the overflow, right? Like you can start seeing that in the future chapters we're going to flesh out. I think especially the external boundary uh, of this structure, right? And how it has mediative qualities, and that there's things that can go wrong, right? And then means by which we get to restoration of these things. Um, and I think most importantly, what you can see as well in this picture is the cross, right? So we have the human body fixed on this cross pattern, right? And uh, yeah, so I think everything goes back to this, right? And it's like, well, how do we look at it? How do we understand it, right? And like Mark said, right, like what is our place from which we're looking, right? And we're going to change our place, right? Like that's also important. Like we're not always looking from the same position.
Are we good? Can we make it to the next chapter?
Yeah, I'm okay with leaving this picture, but I had some more comments about. I don't know if we went through this right, but the pillar of fire that Moses was leading the Israelites, right? Um, so the pillar is directing, but it's also giving light. It's a source of light. We kind of touched on that a little bit, right? And then a cloud is a heavenly covering, right? So that's in some sort a skin, right? By shadowing from the sun, right? It's also a vehicle, a means of movement for the Israelites. Um, yeah, and I think this is something I need to think about more, right? But like one of the things that the pillar is doing, right, is it's staying true to heaven while in movement, right? And so we were talking about the picture of grace, right? Um, and the mediation between the pillar of fire and the cloud, right? Resting when the cloud settles, like there's a way in which that movement, right, like the alternation between these modalities, can be done correctly, right? Because it states like the Israelites were waiting, right? So there's like a signal or a kairos moment that is from the cloud or the pillar that is telling them what the next step is. And so I I think when we're looking at, well, like it's not so much the establishment of space. Let me get back. So this was moving, leading home, bringing out of exile. It's more that moving quality, right? Like there's two things, right? Like there's the recharging, right, or the resting, and the taking action, right? And like we should wait until we can put action in the right direction, right? And we should also rest when we're told to rest, and doing that appropriately is the dance that leads us out of exile and brings us at a place where we can settle. And thereby remaining true to heaven. Oh yeah, and one last thing I wanted to say about the graph, right? So it's connecting the number 3 and 4. And I think this is really important, right? It's because if we're looking at Gödel's incompleteness theorem, right, we're stating that 3 is you can describe everything, but you can't be accurate, and 4 is you can be accurate, but you can't describe everything. I think maybe I'm messing it up, but that's the idea, right? So if you have something that can hold 3 and 4 together, that means that you have the mediative quality, right, or the potential for grace, I guess, to manifest. Right.
Yeah, and I'll just tie that in mathematically, and everybody will scream, but actually completely true, verified with people who actually know math, not me. The circle resolves Gödel's completeness theorem. It is also not mathematical. Technically, Martin Gardner actually did this work, I think. I think it was him. A circle doesn't exist because a circle is an infinite number of points, and points don't actually exist in mathematics. And so, effectively, a perfect circle, and I was listening to a perfect circle earlier today. This is a weird coincidence on music. Is not expressible correctly using mathematics, but it does, to your point, resolve the 3 and 4 problem, right? And the way that you would know a perfect circle is from a telos smaller perfect circle in the middle, right? And so the outside circle is only a manifestation as the result of the inside circle being exactly where it is. And so that's why when your aim isn't true and you're too close to the border of the outside circle, you know you're not aiming correctly, right? You're oriented incorrectly, because your orientation should bring you closer to the center, not closer to the borders, right? It doesn't mean some people aren't going to be at the borders or be on the other side of the borders, as we are about to see. But yeah, it's a good point about Gödel's incompleteness theorem. I don't know why the mathematicians are all upset when the answers were already there for them had they but looked.
Yeah, so I want to point to Arjun's comment where he's talking about horizontal expansion versus vertical translation or expansion, and I think the verticality is the erecting of the space, right, and the horizontality is the population or the fleshing out, the filling up.
The staff versus the organization around the staff, right? Because that's the 12 tribes there, according to the note.
Yep. That's a full staff. Okay. Well, now we're going to please Mark, and we will enter more Moses.
One thing I just wanted to say quickly, since you mentioned gargoyles and we're talking about boundaries of things, the marginal is evidence that your system can't account for something. Like if you scroll up on the previous page, there's that squiggly line with the black question marks, right? And if you're willing to admit you don't know things is not a problem, but if being confident in logic is important to you, then you can't admit the logic itself is procedural, right? Which is a big problem. So if you're worried about logical error, which is an excess of tyranny, too much control, trying to account for too much, you have to deny the black question marks because they represent an inconvenient truth. And the damage that gets done is that faith gets defined as something that you know, right? And that sets you off on the wrong path spiritually and is a great tragedy. So when you said gargoyle, the thing I was thinking about was how do you establish the fact that marginality exists? This is a challenge that I have, right? Like to somebody who sees it, it's abundantly obvious and it's so obvious, right? But you know, to somebody who is has certain maybe the wrong dogma or a little too attached to, I don't know. I mean, it's something that I encounter.
Well,
So
well, like Mark showed the wrong picture there. He should have shown the Telos elephant, the open-ended Telos elephant, not the gargoyle, because there we go. Because because the open-ended, well, the closed Telos elephant, well, that's what you're talking about, right? And at the closed Telos, you can sit inside of your tent, right? And you don't have to look outside, right? And as long as the tent doesn't collapse, you're safe, right?
mm,
But with the open-ended Telos elephant, you you do have things that don't adhere to the telos, right? Even though they're tangentially related. And
Right.
that's the only door that you can give people, right? But they have to accept the telos first, right? Like you have to have them adopt your, well, what is it? Your principality, right? Like the, the thing that rules, right? Of what you're talking about, if they don't accept the authority of what rules and thereby the judgment that comes from that, there's not going to be a way that they're going to see things on the edge, because the edge isn't real, right? Like it just doesn't exist.
I want to quickly highlight this. Marginalia isn't effective defining yourself. The creation of unnecessary marginalia is an effect of defining yourself. One way to think about it is, if you don't accept the definition that you already have as the result of being born, oh, I don't know, maybe, I don't know, let's pick something random that no one's ever heard of because it's silly. Let's suppose you were born male and you tried to insist you were female. That might unravel all of society. And it could, right? And I'm just speaking hypothetically here, or not at all. So yeah, I mean,
Can we just stay in
marginalia,
reality, Mark? Like, why are
yeah,
you at the marginalia?
yeah. But marginalia, as stated much earlier, in earlier chapters, you have to have that. You build that into the system. You leave a little bit at the edges of the field unharvested. You leave a fringe on the garments, right? On purpose, right? Because it has to be accounted for correctly. It just doesn't have to be accounted for systematically or procedurally, to Danny's earlier excellent point.
Okay. So we can start out with Moses's second sign, I think. So this is the authority, or I guess the participation with God that was supposed to prove that he was sent by God. Um, and Moses took his hand out of his chest, right? So we're talking about the place that holds his heart, right? Like it's the place that Eve got made from, right? Like there's a lot of connections there, and in some sense, right? Like taking your hand from there is analogous as taking Eve from your side, because Eve was the helper, right? And like, so what's your hand? Well, like the hand is that which helps you manifest yourself. Um, so I think I see a whole analogy there, right? Also, your heart is the your center, right? Like at least the center of your manifestation, right? Your life. So when something comes from your heart, it also shows whether you're true or not, right? So when your hand appears leprous from your heart, right, that means that the way that you manifest yourself is not with integrity, right? Like it's disintegrated, and so I I think that's a important setup to look at this chapter, and then also we have to realize that before this miracle, Moses grabbed the staff by the tail, right? So that was a movement of his hand, right? So we're also moving in a fractal manner, where you're getting from the thing in the world, right, and having grip on the thing in the world, right, it's having grip on the thing that you're having grip with. So it's the same movement, one fractal layer up towards humanity.
Yeah, one is a transition of an external item based on your action, and the other one is a transition of your body based on an action, both with the hand. And it also shows mastery over things outside. So not just physical material outside, but the manifestation of a disease, because that's non-material effectively, right? I mean, biologists would tell you they can break it down to material, but that's actually technically incorrect. Proof too long for this book club. But you can look into it. If you look long enough, you'll find it. And so this is more an ethereal show of control over the world, basically, right? Via God. And that, I think, is the important part. And this idea of leprosy, or at least their version of it, because leprosy refers to a bunch of things, as it turns out. There are, and it's modified over time because evolution is roughly speaking true. So the species has changed and evolved, but it also referred to like 3 or 4 different actual diseases from our recent conception, we'll say. They just lumped them all into leprosy because that was the correct answer, and we've got it all wrong. Different problem. So yeah, I mean, I think that's important setup for the diagrams.
Yeah, and I want to state that what is leprosy, right? Like leprosy is your nurse no longer participating with you. So it's a rebellion of that which mediates you with the external world, right? So I think if we look at it technically, it's actually a really accurate description, even biologically, for the dysfunction of the skin, right? And then because the skin is not necessarily in rebellion to you, but it's no longer partaking. uh, it it in some sense becomes autonomous, right? Or without aim or something, right? It becomes disconnected, right? And then it can no longer partake or adhere to the body, right? And so it's a loss of authority over your body. So talking about authority,
Yeah,
when
on the I was going to say on the diagram here, when they get to that, disease is basically like a loss of stability in the structure. So
right, yeah, yeah. So we're going to talk about disease, right? And then leprosy is a specific type of disease that's constrained to
right.
the skin, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the thing that I wanted to point out is we start off with an instruction by God, right? And I think it's maybe important to stand still what it actually means, because like it's not often clear, right? It's like, now bring your hand to your chest, right? It's like, well, what does that mean, right? It was like, it's it's like taking a moment of silence, right? Having communion between your heart and your hand, right? But it's also pointing you, right, your attention. It's shedding light upon the relationship between your hand and your chest, right? And then you might realize the sin, right, as a consequence of looking at the relationship between your heart and your hand, and you see, oh, my hand isn't acting out what my heart wants, right? Well, that is your hand being leprous, right? Like that's literally what you're seeing. Oh, my hand is not partaking in my heart's will, my heart's desire. That's the right word. So God's direction is revealing something about the nature of the hand, right? And it's connected to the loss of agency, right? Like, and then the second instruction goes, right? It's like, okay, you have lost agency, return it, and now a blessing happens, and the agency returns, right? So there's I don't know, like I don't know what happened in between, but uh, it is as a consequence of trust in God or something that this connection gets restored or healed. That's maybe a better word. And I wanted to point out at the word snow, right? So snow is multiplicity, right? It's like sand, like dust, right? Uh, so it's water in the form of multiplicity. So if it looks like snow, it's like a flooding of the hand, right? Like that's basically what the snow is representing there.
I wanted to just add as well with the imagery of the leprosy too. When you look, the word also means to peel, but also to be delicate or soft, but also to be scaled or flaky. So there is, just to kind of tie in that you're also getting a little bit of like snake imagery, just a bit, some of the qualities of the exterior of the snake. With this, it doesn't literally have to be that, oh, now you have a reptilian hand, but there are some similarities between the two types of imagery.
Yeah. Last thing I wanted to point out on this thing is that the signs have a voice, right? So they speak for themselves, right? So in some manner, like this thing that has been granted to Moses has its own voice, its own way of speaking, its own way of communicating, and thereby is not reliant on Moses. He's just the vessel that brings that sign.
One other thing to just add to that, I don't need the diagram, is that you have the voice aspect. So that's also, it's if they don't hear the call of the first sign, but there's an element of there's a call from the voice, but then there's a necessity of following that voice. And I just wanted to kind of say that there's a connection between sign or signal and to follow. Just to the point of, I haven't listened to it, but to the point of Mark's live stream the other day, there is this thing about the voice and then the necessity of the signal that sort of implies that there is a following that's supposed to be happening there, or at least ideally, assuming it's a good signal, but it tends to imply a following.
Yeah, and I think the biblical word that would be used there is wonder, signs and wonders. So the wonder follows the sign, which would be a signal that is previously unknown. Right? That's basically what the sign is pointing to. So we're talking about sin as contamination from the outside, right? So there's means by which the external through the skin enters, right?
Well, Manuel, I want to back up real quick to that top line, because this is the most important thing if you take nothing else away from this book. Biblical cosmology is much wider, important word, than the scientific definition because it is based on meaning rather than mechanism. Right. And that should tell you, if you think about it long enough, like not right away, but if you think about it long enough, that should tell you everything you need to know about why 4 causes is important and why you need to make final cause great again. That goes back to telos and aim from the we'll call it the key diagram from earlier, right? And then all of that is important because what this is showing is that there are different stages and forms of dis-ease, right? When you're at ease, you're in the previous diagram. That is ease. Establishing space is ease, right? When you are dis-eased, there's a breakdown somewhere. And these are the stages of it. So I think it's really important to understand that. In other words, there is a signal before you get tired that if you ignore will make you worse off, right? And so there's all sorts of ways that we ignore, we'll say the middle stage, right, before we hit the wall. And there's no reason to hit the wall if you're just kind of paying attention to your body, right? And it's not foolproof, but it's way better than nothing, right? Which is what most people do, or actively ignoring the signal that you're tired. And so it's important to realize that this is how it works. You have time to say, take 2 points damage instead of 10, right? Or however you want to frame it in your head. And that's the process of dis-ease. And like modern medicine recognizes this. Oh, we caught your cancer at stage 1. We can treat it. Oh, we caught it at stage 3. We can't. This is the same thing, right? It just took them a lot longer to get there because science is stupid and slow. So I just wanted to highlight all that before we sort of dove into the rest of this, but please continue.
Well, yeah, a different way to phrase that is fitting a purpose, right? So there's ways where you're fulfilling your purpose, and then you get frustrated, and in the frustration you become less and less capable to adhere to your purpose, right? So that's the same process, right? But in the spirit, less so in the body.
I think that's a really good point of kind of staying constant to your principle, even despite exile or whatever sort of stuff. I mean, you think about these things with the Israelites wind up getting captured and they end up in Babylon, and they're actually explicitly told not to rebel. They're actually told to just sit there and take it for a while, and eventually things will turn out. And that there is that sort of constancy required of them to not try to. There's a certain suffering involved where it's just like there is a struggle within yourself, like a spiritual struggle, but a lot of times there's a certain value in it just being a spiritual struggle, and at least allowing the rest of the things to kind of get resolved. Because if you're just trying to if you're on the roof of your house and there's flooding or something like that, you're not just going to go out into the water and start resolving the water. A lot of times you just have to kind of sit there and take it for a while and wait for things to resolve. And but there is this bit about sometimes you look at this diagram and you see that the disease has kind of taken hold on this image. If you imagine this as a person or something like that, and that the things have been lost. So we have the example of leprosy, but this person who has lost a significant portion of themselves on the left side of the diagram is at least, I mean, we can't, I can't speak to their state of mind, but if they remain in that state, then at least they have their connection to that principle. They're not completely underwater at this point. And you can also have, I mean, sometimes it's not entirely necessary. So I heard a couple of stories recently. There was one, there was a kid that experienced a miracle within like the last couple decades or something like that. He was born without an optical nerve. So he just couldn't, so like the eyes were fine, but there was just no optical nerve. Like they did x-rays that just didn't exist and everything. Goes to a holy site, receives his sight back, was able to see, they did the x-ray, no optical nerve, right? So he could describe everything around him, but he could see without an optical nerve. So it was like a constant miracle that was going on there. So you have that sort of, you've got the rectification without actually being materially rectified. So he was technically still blind, but he was able to see 20/20. And then, there was another guy that it was around the time that they had actually cured leprosy, like the Hansen's disease. To say within the last 100 years, there was a guy who he was leprous for a long time. And he lost a bunch of body parts. I mean, he lost an eye, he lost, a significant portion of his limbs and everything like that, was not doing well. And he was convalescing, but they were able to cure or at least stop the spread of the leprosy within his body. But he was left in that state. So he was the left side of this diagram. The water had receded, but he was just stuck in this state of having lost all of that additional material of himself. And so he's kind of dealing with the fact that he couldn't actually really do anything except just lie in bed and age. And he could speak as well, but he was mostly blind at that point. And there was a thing where I think it was like a nun brought a statue of the Virgin Mary to him, and he could barely see, so he got really close. And in that state, like he was the left side of the diagram, he said, "How good God is to me." Like he was actually, he just proclaimed, he was like, "Gosh, like life is good." And it's like, that guy is so much better than I'll ever be, but it's like, that's just kind of that, there's that constancy to the principle that even in those times of exile, even bodily exile, where you are reduced to a seed, in a sense, whether you're out in Babylon or if it's happening at the bodily scale, there is that sort of importance and the possibility of some sort of restoration that's at least satisfactory.
Yeah. So I was going through this idea of that the contamination comes from the outside, right? And I think the adherence to the principle is that which brings healing. I think that's really important to realize. And talking about adherence to the principle, like I was reading or listening to Moses earlier today, or Exodus, I guess, and he gets adopted by the queen, right? So he gets inserted at the principal, right? The royalty of Egypt, and from there he moves, right? So he gains some authority, and it's the same king goes for King David, and when uh, they're in exile in Babylon, there's this Jewish woman who becomes a concubine or even a wife of the Babylonian king, right? So uh, there's this constant attaching yourself to the powers that be, and then the action can happen, right? Like then the Kairos moment can manifest, and before that you have to be patient, right? Like you don't have sufficient grounding to act as a people, and if you would act as a people, then you would destroy yourself, right? Because like you'd be fighting an impossible fight. But if you got a foothold at the right place, then you kind of get this ability to act. I actually think that Jesus is a contradiction to this, because like he's explicitly not connecting to King Herod at that time, although John the Baptist gets into his court, I think, but he gets killed for it. But yeah, I don't know what that means, but just something to point out that Jesus is not coming in through the earthly powers. I think that it's connected to that.
I will, to that point, if you're saying kind of like the earthly powers of like royalty, that I think historically Saint Joseph is actually the rightful heir of the Davidic kingdom, but the Davidic kingdom had dissipated at that point, so there was no longer, like, the tribe of Judah was no longer in control. But if it had been, then he would have actually been king, so he's technically nobility.
Okay. That's getting too theological for me, right? um. Okay, so yeah, he's connecting the disease, right, to the flooding of the externality, right? So when you got leprosy, when the skin isn't functioning properly, like Daniel says, right? Like if you're in a tent and the rain isn't kept out, you're getting flooded, right? And then now you have to deal with water on the inside, and that's gonna mess everything up, right? Like your food is gonna rot, all of things like that.
Yeah, I mean he's tying it into all the ways in which disease spreads and becomes. I mean, we would call it plague, right? It's just disease here, but it's plague. And then the results of plague, like plague doesn't stay on the body; it actually kind of spreads to the linen and then to the walls.
Yeah. So let me see. So he's looking at three frames, right? So one is the actual skin, right? Like then we have the garment, which is like the artificial skin, and then the house, which is like the skin that's we don't wear, right? So it is a skin that
It's
we
the
live
skin of the
in,
family.
right? Like it's the skin that holds us, right? Like it's a space that's established for us.
More than one of us. Like, like it's the individualism that I'm pushing back on here. It's like, yeah, the purpose of a house is to hold a family, not a person. Right? Because if all you need to do is hold a person, you just need clothes. You don't need a house. Like you can be a nomad, it's fine. It's not a problem. Also, you shouldn't do that. You should get a family. But yeah, that's what a house does. It holds the whole family. It's the skin for the larger body.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a collective identity that's transcending the personal identity. That is correct. So when we keep these frames in mind, right? Like we're talking here about hairs as a specific thing, right? So what is a hair? Well, hair is something that punctures the skin, right? So it's like it's like a channel of mediation. You can also see it as something that creates a pillar on the skin where things can happen, right? Um, but it's at least you could maybe see it as a gate. That would be the analogy with a city, right? And then let me see. Oh yeah, so we're having woolen or linen garment here. So what you can see there is that the wool is coming from animals, while the linen is coming from plants. So that's if you go back to Genesis 1, you have the animals and the plants. They get created at different days, right? So they're representative of different levels of skin or whatever you wanna talk about it. Um, and then leather, which is literally the skin of an animal, which wool isn't. And then and they're talking about the green or red plague. Um, so I don't know if anybody of you has associations with it. I think red is connected to blood, and green is connected to the green plants, shrubbery. But yeah, that's maybe too much to get into.
Yeah, I don't know why it's relevant here. You're just talking
It
about
it's
the
not.
scale of disease, not.
Well, I think let's just say that the color of the plague is a typology, right? So it's talking about the way it's affecting things or something, right? I just want to point out that there's all of these categories, right? So there's the type of garment, right, which is the type of mediation or something, right? The functionality of the mediation, and then the color of the garment, which is a means or something. It would be like a filter, maybe that's a way to think about it. Let me see. Yeah, so here you have the colors as well, and then you have a depth of penetration, right? So if something is only in the wall, then it's the plague, right? Like, so there's also deeper manifestations of the plague. Does anybody want to talk about this diagram?
Yeah, I mean, this is all about what flooding looks like. Disease is a flooding of disorder or chaos. Right. And I think that's the best way to understand it. That's why they're talking about the 3 different layers: the skin, the garments, and the house, or the walls of the house. Right. So that's a flooding at an extra dimension, right? Not just the floor is flooded, because that doesn't make any sense unless it's only water. Disease is not a water-like thing. It's airborne, roughly speaking, for most part. And so once the breakdown happens, and this applies to any breakdown, not just, we'll say, a virus or something crazy, right? Once the breakdown happens, it happens at all the scales, right? And then that's given this crazy Zarath name. So that is the change from artificial space or established space, right, into primitive nature. And that's what disease is doing. It's a form of entropic degeneration from ordered to disordered, and from the artificial space, right, held correctly, to time separated, and therefore a flood.
Yeah, and a different perspective you can take on that is that you're returning to the dominion of nature, right? So you're subject to nature, because if you don't have claws, like, nature will just do things to you that it will, right? And then all you can do is respond, right? So when you put on claws, especially in the winter now, right, you get to act out your will, you get to do what you want. But if those claws fall away, like, all you can do is find a source of heat. Like, there's nothing else you can do, because you'll die, right? So there's a freedom that is associated with the artificiality that's prerequisite to do other things, right? So if you don't have walls in your house, if they don't function, then you don't have the safety of your house, right? And then without the safety, you just can't do certain things, right? Like, you can't have peace effectively, right? And I think we can connect peace to homeostasis, right? Like, maybe, like, peace is just a way better word than homeostasis. Because it's peace is I think relating to the things that require attention, right? Like, or
You have to
require
work at
solving.
peace. Homeostasis is a state of no work. That's the difference.
I want to just, without, it's not necessary to get scientific about it, but just to make an association with mold as well, because, like, all of these manifestations also map onto mold. You got the white hair, you got the manifestation of the red or green. It can get into clothes, it can get into skin, it can get into walls, all these sorts of things. And it tends to, especially if it's within a living space or something like that, it tends to indicate that there's well, usually that there's some moisture. So you do have a little bit of kind of like a soft flooding that's going on. But also it usually means that the space is not being properly maintained. You know, like it's a lot less likely that you're going to get mold on your skin if you're regularly, you know, cleaning yourself, you know, those sorts of things. Same thing with the home. If the pipes are well maintained, if it was actually constructed correctly, you know, like all of these things just kind of indicate that bit about the establishing artificial space and then being overtaken. It's not necessary that it's exactly the same thing, but mold can be observed as a manifestation of this type of thing.
Yeah, so I think, right, like renewal, right? You're talking about it, right, which is washing, right, or cleaning, um, which is actually exposure to water. It's a mini flood, but also it's undressing before going to bed or something, right? So you're taking off the thing that you're wearing, right, so that you can be in a different state, a different relationship, so that you can be renewed, right?
Right,
So
but that's not breakdown. Like, breakdown is bad. Like it's
no, but that's voluntary uh, taking part in that pattern, right?
yeah,
Where
you're
you're not.
reversing the pattern of garments of skin. Right. What you want to do is burn off the dead wood. That's what you want to do. Right. And you can't confuse like getting dressed and undressed for other processes, right? I mean, that's why they're unique and distinct and easy in language. And that's like a flattening, right? When you say, oh, well, taking off your clothes is just like, no, it's not like anything else. That's why we have a phrase for it. And we have different phrases for every other thing that isn't that, right? It's not a, it it's, you know, you also can't flatten it in time, right? You can't say like, well, you know, these are really the same thing. I mean, what did they do it with the other day? Oh yeah, doubt and belief, right? It's like, no, doubt and belief are not the same thing. Right? Because people play with the language that way all the time. It's like, no, one comes before the other and it matters. It's like, um, you can have renewal without breakdown. That's actually not hard. Uh, it's a, right, and that's the thing. Like breakdown is bad. Don't do that. There's no reason for that. You can avoid breakdown instead. I mean, this is what I was talking about with the previous set of diagrams on disease, right? You can avoid that because there are signals. Again, see Navigating Patterns live stream from last night. There are signals that are available to you to make sure you don't break down, right? Like, and like if you hear your lifters tapping and you take your car in, you won't blow up the motor because you ran out of oil because you heard the lifters tapping. It's not that hard, really. I get not everybody can hear the lifters tapping, which just freaks me out because I can hear it rather clearly. And that's the problem, is that when we don't see the differences in these things, when we don't have the discernment, and fair enough if you don't, like we're living in the age of gnosis materialism, then this all becomes a set of wrongly formulated problems with necessarily wrongly formulated solutions. The idea of breakdown is that you failed. Like in order for something to break down, there's a failure point somewhere. It might not be you, but most likely it is. And then now repair has to happen, not renewal. And those are different. That's why they're different words, right? Renewal can happen as a result of sleep. Well, I don't break down every time I go to sleep, right? I go to sleep voluntarily usually. It's not a breakdown of the waking state. The waking state is an interruption of sleep. All right, it's a rational interruption of the irrational unconscious world, and or a resurrection from death. You know, if you want to go with Mitchell's been talking about recently, and yeah, you can't confuse repair and renewal. Different words for different reasons. It's like it's hard not to get flat with this stuff, but the reason why this is laid out in like 3 sequences in many of these diagrams is because that's actually really important, and so is the ordering. And we're not paying attention to ordering, and we're flattening things because we want single answers, and the world just isn't comprised of single answers. So you have to look at the disease and the exile, which is, basically what we're coming up on here is the exile from camp, as a protection of the camp so that the plague does not spread. And the results of an exile may be that the person exiled becomes a sacrifice, and you could link that to Girard and say scapegoat. And that's the problem that we run into, is that we don't like that answer. But that could be the answer, and it's kind of out of your hands, right? What happens to the exile? But the fact of exile is real and explicit. And I think, again, when you start to get confusions in language, things get sticky fast. And when you compress things down, it really, it's not that it's not clear what you're talking about. It's that what you're talking about gets projected into, and then people interpret it any way they want. And now you're not saying anything because the thing you said and intended is not communicated outward properly. And that happens a lot. And it's sort of hard to avoid to some extent when talking about biblical stuff, because the best language for this is so-called Christian language. But you're often dealing with people who don't have that or have access to it. And so they're sort of stuck in the scientific language, and dancing between the two is very hard.
But yeah, I don't agree with you, Mark, because you break down a camp, right? Like that's undressing a camp. So
you can break down a camp, right? And that has to happen before you can rebuild the camp.
Right, which is undressing, right? Like what do you do? You replace the camp, right? Or I like the word that Mark
after you have
about.
built the thing, you can then do something to the thing, but the order actually matters.
Like, but I like the word that
100%.
he's using is repair, right? So you pair it with its environment. Like I think there's a way, because why do you have a camp? Well, you have a camp that's set up in a certain way, right? Like you want to have defensive positions, right? You want to have access to water. You want to have all of these things, right? So you don't only set up a camp to have a place to rest or whatever.
You repair a camp when it's broken, not when it's broken down, right? And renewal can happen independent of all the other things. And that's that's the enchantment that you need, right? Like you can be renewed by the Holy Spirit. Like that can happen. That's not a you thing, right?
So
and that's
like
why the distinction's actually important.
I like what Mark initially said about balance as being a process of what in this pattern do you need to do to balance the highs and the lows. So in the daily cycle, if you want to sleep, humans need a load to bear. You need to exert yourself the proper amount. If you overtrain and slam your nervous system, you will also have insomnia and won't be able to sleep because you'll be amped up. Very easy problem, very common problem, right? But I like thinking about balance. What balance means depends on your parameters. It depends on your, if you're sick, what it means to rest is different. Like maybe you probably shouldn't be doing any, if you're at a different place, resting might be running 5 miles. That might be a rest day for you, if you, right? So I like thinking in those terms. I thought that was helpful. But also, as you were talking earlier about disease on the physical, the flesh, the garment, I was thinking about the technological layer, materials like polyester, incredible. And then the home as being the antidote to chaos. Or like when you are on zero sleep and you probably like for fixing your circadian rhythm, get a cup of coffee and power through the day if you're not like super sick. But you need a reason to get a cup of coffee and power through the day. So that's kind of I was thinking about disease. Also, I like what you said about dis-ease, about if you have problems. I mean, we could talk about this, unpack this among 1,000 different dimensions all day long, right? But there's a lot of things that can make people sick in ways that are not have to do with the flu or whatever, throwing up and stuff, right? Like if you don't like not having an adequate domestic environment can cause problems that probably are like we don't even know about or like have the tools to talk about, modern science.
Right,
you know,
or working too continuously for too long,
or if
physically
you
or
don't have
mentally.
autonomy. Like there's a bazillion things.
Right.
You know, it's like
Right. That causes your ease, right? Because John Vervaeke talks about flow state, right? Fair enough, right? But flow state is an ease. But if you stay in the flow state too long, you'll get adrenal burnout. Actually, a lot of people don't know that. They think like, oh, I'm super efficient, using energy more efficiently. Yeah, but you're still using way more energy than you would be if you were resting, you dumbass. And so if you try to stay in the flow state too long, you'll just burn yourself out. And I've seen this. This is why I'm always puzzled when people don't mention it. I'm like, do you not know people? Have you not seen them? Have you not seen this phenomenon? It's all over the place, right? Because they didn't leave room to renew, right? Because you don't need to break down to renew. You can just stop running, right? And that allows a renewal, right? So for example, one of the things that renews when you stop doing, we'll say, too much continuous physical exercise, is your you stop putting out so much lactic acid, and your ability to absorb more lactic acid into your system recovers, right? Same with alcohol in the liver, by the way. Like all these things work roughly the same way, which is again around the balance. And yeah, there's ways around it, and there's things you can do, and whatever. Like you can always like trick the system or stretch the boundaries or whatever. But when you are going to be wrong about that, because you are, the collapse is going to be huge. So it's better not to play with those things in general. And there may be times when you have to, right? Like I have on occasion, although very infrequently, actually grabbed the freaking Red Bull and powered through a 72-hour coding session like that because it had to be done. I don't regret it. I wish it hadn't have been necessary, but also like sometimes you have to do that, right? Like and you should push through things more often when you're sick. You should just be more careful about it, right? And not when you're well, because when you do it when you're well, what's going to happen is you're going to blow yourself up and take yourself out for days or weeks at a time, right? And that's part of the problem, is that if you renew, you can make sure you don't break down, right? That's part of the trick. Like, oh, if I take some time to renew now, I won't break down later, right? And again, this is why sequence matters. Right. And you can't just single example everything because in a single example, with a single example, it's not that hard.
Okay, I think we will leave it here for today.
Yeah.
So who wants to provide a easing frame for the reflection? No one? So we were talking about kind of mediating between rest and an artificial space, I guess, and holding on to that space for certain or exertion, you can call it as well, right? For a period of time.
So Manuel, how about this? How about the role of renewal, the role and importance of, let's say, voluntary renewal in maintaining established space, and that ties these two sections together.
You wanted to add something, Danny?
I was going to suggest balancing across the various dimensions of a human, which are not just physical. So, there's spiritual, emotional, there's lots of aspects to a person. And I think, I don't know, I think many of these aspects get less attention than are deserved. Or actually, I mean, if you look at people who have problems, like if you look at people who have problems, like there's so many problems that people have that they don't know they have. They're completely invisible to them. Like in terms of what drives people. I mean, what is salient is, you don't know what drives you, and that's and the world manifests itself according to your aims. Like these are big things. You could spend, as Peterson says, you spend 4 years in college. If there's one thing you could spend thinking about, like that's a profound thing. The fact, anyway, these are big. I was just going to suggest balancing across some of these subtle dimensions.
Right. So you have something more concrete about how that balance, how you look at that.
Yeah, I mean, I have my own. Yeah, personally, I have a lot of tools, physically. I mean, but I
Okay.
could talk about
But
things all day long. But
Mark was trying to get the role of rest and renewal in there, right? So I think if we want to add balance into that makes like great because I like the way I'm seeing it is right. You're having a bunch of spaces that you're maintaining, right? And some of them are subconscious, right? You're just trying to hold on to this space and they just wreck you, right? Like because you just keep on holding on to something you don't need to hold on to, and then your energy is just gone, right? So when we're talking about balance, like I see it more as attending to all of these things, right, and giving them the room to renew, right, to restore, to decohere. Um, Anyway, I think we got enough framework, and we'll figure it out on our own in the reflection. Yeah, leave some questions or comments, and we can get back to them after our reflection. Okay, who wants to share?
Well, I was thinking as far as this the initial reflection was trying to get the balance between the rest and the work. That I'm just thinking of this thing of, we were talking about the process of balancing, that there's, as a mediator or the person who is responsible, able to make a response, that whatever it is, that there is a necessity for them to be kind of acting in microcosm of their environment to make the necessary changes, sometimes very, very tiny ones, as you have an existing balance and you're not trying to establish the initial balance. Like to get onto a bicycle requires a lot more than, staying on it in terms of those tiny little movements. And yet the process is continual. So over time, the maintenance does require a lot more responsibility than the initial getting on. I'm not very good at riding a bike, so I could very easily get onto a bike, but and I could very easily stay on the bike. But a lot of times that transition between the two, it's not the same thing. But thinking about this thing of, if you have too much rest, then you have the responsibility of making that sacrifice and, establishing space. Otherwise, you're going to get flooded. But also, with assuming that how would I put this? Well, you have the reverse where there's too much work, you have too much stability, that there's a lot of times a sacrifice in making yourself rest, and that's especially something that I kind of have a difficult time with, because you're also sometimes you're balancing the different layers as well. So it's like, to Mark's point, a lot of times there might be a situation where, yes, it would be prudent for you to actually make the sacrifice of not working so much so that you don't burn yourself out. But also there might be something where it's, I remember hearing somebody say this example of, they had been working on their roof, putting up a new roof on their house for hours and hours, and they were exhausted and everything. And they thought, okay, I'm just going to stop working right now, and then we'll finish the job tomorrow or over the next 2 days. And then they found out that there was a thunderstorm coming, which they were not anticipating before. And then it's just like, oh, the thunderstorm is coming in 12 hours. And it's like, okay, so the next 2 or 3 days of work we are doing tonight. That's what we're doing. And it's just like, yeah, that probably resulted in burnout. Like most likely, like they might have even gotten sick after that or something. But, kind of recognizing that bit of, on the personal scale, you have to make certain sacrifices so that you can maintain that stability. But once you start going up the scale, depending on how many people are taking that responsibility, or you get like a Moses figure, something like that he's sacrificing significant. You think when the Israelites are rebelling, that God offers to just wipe them out and then just make a kingdom from Moses's kids. And Moses actually intercedes on behalf of the people that were just driving him insane anyway and rebelling against him, as we'll see next week. Even his own family were rebelling against him, and he still prays for them despite all that. And as a result, like, his family doesn't turn into a kingdom. Like, he actually sacrifices a lot by trying to maintain that stability, and the stability didn't actually last all that long. And yet that's kind of the leader's responsibility. So sometimes, even if the ship is going down, like, you still got to do something, at least now. Like, you got to make a decision. You don't give up until defeat has happened, and but yeah, I heard something this week, just like a day or two ago, something like that. I think it was like Saint Ignatius that said something like, he worked 40 years after his conversion, after getting hit by a cannonball in the knee. And he said, he worked for 40 years and he did all this work and he made a lot of big strides. But he said, if he had worked all of that time and the only result was that one person didn't commit one mortal sin, and that he was able to, with 40 years of work, prevent them from doing that, and then immediately after preventing it, the person committed a mortal sin and died and went to hell, that it would have been worth it. And that he would have actually put in that much effort, which is like at a very extreme perspective, but to the point of, like, he was actually willing to put in 40 years of arduous balancing for the stability at the higher levels, even if it was temporary, and so just kind of, that's sort of my reflection for this one.
Yeah, so the word that I heard there is restoration. Um, and the words that came up for me in my reflection were devotion, uh, and then within a container, right? Because that's the thing that holds the devotion, right? And then you transition between things that you devote yourself to, right? And that allows the other things not to weigh on you. Because if you carry too many things with you at once, right? Like then we were talking about all the things pulling at you, right? And that's the thing that devotion solves, I think. But also like that devotion can get you stuck, right? So that's where the transition rituals are important. And then the second thing that came up from there is that you have to keep your relations clean, right? So the relations that you have need to be smooth. They need to be well oiled, because if you are in a relation that is frustrating you, like you can't produce, like you can't give fruits of that. And that gave me to the place, right? Um, you have to recognize that the path that you're on is fruitful, right? So like there might be a frustration from you, there might be a frustration from the external world, right? Like there might also be a compatibility issue at the moment or whatever, right? Like all of these things, they make your work futile, right? Like you're not gonna manifest the purpose that you're there for. So why are you even partaking if you're not gonna manifest the purpose? And I think that's really right. Like at certain points, you not don't even have to try. And you could do something else instead, right? Which would allow you to try in a future point. Um, and then the third or the last thing that I had is like you outsource through submission, right? So one way to lubricate your participation is just to submit, right, and give the responsibility for uh, attending to the container or whatever to someone else, right, so that you don't have to carry these things by yourself. Uh, so I think that's also a really important thing, and I think that's actually if we're trying to establish space for ourselves, right? Like that's the means by which we get to get into that space, right? We get to explore and familiarize ourselves without being overburdened. Well, thanks everybody for watching, and we will talk about the disease in peoples next time.